So welcome, everybody. We're glad to see different names appearing on the screen here. And over the next few minutes, there'll be others joining us because actually we have quite an interest in today's webinar. We've had over 150 people indicate that they'd like to be at the webinar or get the replay or something. So we want to welcome everybody that's here. And some names are recognizable to me and others are new friends. And it's because we have a new guest presenter with us today. But I'm Dr. Dan Reinhardt, the president of Crest Leadership. And with me also is Jon Pritchard. He's our lead facilitator. And Dan Woodard is our guest today, which I'll introduce him in a little bit more detail in a bit here. But we've got all these new friends of Dan on here is what it is. Dan's got this amazing network of all you people that follow along with Dan. And so we welcome all of these friends of Dan here today. This is just for a brief introduction for people who are new to our webinar here. I'm just going to very briefly let you know what Crest is about. We are a program of helping people in the midlife and second half to get clarity so that their second half can be their best half. And we've been doing this for 20 years. We have hundreds of graduates, and we help people really flourish in their second half. So Jon Pritchard is our lead facilitator. Jon, just tell people briefly how we deliver this to them.
Well, with COVID, we diversified. For the first number of years, it was all in person through cohorts. One of the nuances of adult learning is we love experts, but we also love to learn together. And so rubbing off on each other and just peer learning. And so we learn from each other. And so the cohort model, small group model, has really worked well for us. So when we diversified a couple of years ago and went into online version cohorts, we tried to keep that same sort of priority and put people in cohorts so that even online, they can still learn together and communicate, interact, collaborate on different assignments and stuff like that. So definitely the cohort model has really worked well for us in the delivery of the content.
We also do these monthly webinars that you're on right now. For some of you, this is your first one. And we do this every month, actually. So if you've signed up, you'll get a notification of what the next one's about. And we enjoy doing this because this is when we get to have conversation with folks that are not in our regular program, friends like Dan Woodard. So I'd like to just introduce Dan a little bit more to those of you that don't know him. Dan and I actually go back a long ways, and Dan's got this incredible memory. He can remember when he met someone, and he tells me, how many years ago did we meet, Dan?
It's 26 now, I think.
26 years. So we've had a long time together, but I didn't know his story much. I just knew of him because of our joint connection through the homeschooling movement, but met him and just became friends with him over time. And then things really got a lot more interactive lately. And Dan, that's when you did a leadership webinar or seminar with a local church here. So tell us about what happened there and then how you involved me here.
Well, about 27 months ago, I got a call from Jim Stenstrom. He's going to be interviewed here in a little bit, asking me to come over to Three Hills and have a chat with his leadership team. I dragged my feet and resisted as much as possible. I eventually did go over there, heard their story. They heard the 5-minute version of my story. They asked me to share in their Sunday morning service. I dragged my feet on that too. And then when I did that, before I got out of town, they convinced myself and you, Dan, to do the series. So that's how this whole thing started.
Yeah, and it generated a lot of interest in the church. It was a good experience. And then through Dan's network, other people became really, really interested. And so that's what we're doing today, is telling the story a bit of how this all came to pass. So I'm going to, every once in a while, I will share a PowerPoint here. So today, here's how we're going to do the webinar. We're going to have three main sections to it. Dan will tell a bit of his foundational story, and then he'll talk about the healing path and how the Lord has just transformed his life and his relationships. And now we'll talk about the calling he senses, the vision he has to help others through the ministry that he's been given and the opportunity he's been given. So Dan, maybe just start us out here with telling us a little bit about your story here.
Well, there's a verse in Psalms that says, blessed are those whose hearts are on a pilgrimage. And the idea behind the verse is it's good to see our lives in story. And there's another verse in Proverbs that says God actually writes his story on the tablets of our hearts. And so in that context, I'll be sharing here this morning. And the thing, God's story transcends every part of every part of our story for his purpose. And God's purpose is always good. And so in the story, just another comment before I talk about these rules. It can be a challenge if we're unaccustomed to being honest and honoring our parents sometimes, being honest and honorable at the same time. Then there may be some parts of this conversation that may feel a little uncomfortable, but I dearly love my parents, and they both have gone to be with the Lord now. And so it's in that context that I share this story. So I was raised with 6 rules. I was not aware of these rules at all until I was age 34. But in retrospect, the rules were very, very pronounced. And so the first rule I was raised with was don't talk. And I am 4th generation Woodard. Children are to be seen and not heard. Children and women are to be seen and not heard. And so I was raised to not talk, and we never talked at the meal times. That was only for eating. The second rule I was raised with was don't feel. And so the way that was verbalized was stop your crying. And so we weren't allowed to cry. And the only thing really that I felt for the years that my primary emotion was fear, but I wasn't aware of that. I just felt it all the time, and sort of like walking on eggshells all the time. The rule don't trust. I remember my dad telling me a couple of different times, this is an exact quote, don't ever tell people outside this house what's going on inside, because if they ever know, they'll use it against you every time. So we learn not to trust people. And the fourth rule was don't think. We were just told don't ask questions. And so we didn't ask questions. I recently took a course in life coaching and learned how to ask open questions. It was amazing to ask questions. So the fifth rule was don't choose, just do what you're told. We heard that all the time. And then the sixth rule was don't change. Don't ever change, because if you change, that's compromise. And so don't ever change. And so, it's really interesting because these rules are actually the 6 ACOA rules and ACOA stands for Adult Children of an Alcoholic. So we did not have any alcohol in our home. We didn't have any drugs, but we had the culture of most every alcoholic home. The culture is these 6 rules. And it's interesting because when I was 8 years old, our family went to a Bible conference, sort of like a preaching conference. And we heard these preachers, and they were the 3 most well-known preachers in our fellowship of conservative churches. And every one of these preachers told the story of their alcoholic parent. 2 of them had an alcoholic dad, and 1 of them had an alcoholic mom. And I remember leaving that conference thinking, I will never have a good testimony because my parents don't drink. And so I'll have a blah testimony. Well, we had, so these preachers were all 3 ACOAs. They probably did not know that, but they sure told the stories of how they were ACOAs without using that phrase. And so that's what I had in common with these 3 speakers looking back. And in fact, the fellowship of churches that I was raised in, so far, every one that I have looked at their heritage, every one of them was an ACOA. And it's impossible for ACOA culture to just be limited in the home. Eventually, it's going to show itself in the church or in the Bible college that these men started. And so I have ACOA culture very strong. So the next slide, I show my parents. So I've had a front row seat to the effects of rules-based Christianity to the 3rd generation. So by what I'm referring to there is we were very strict. We were very conservative, and we church hopped for the first 14 years of my life. The reason we church hopped is because we were always looking for the perfect church. The perfect church was had 2 character traits. Number 1, we always heard a salvation message on Sunday morning. That's the perfect church. And secondly, we wouldn't want to be a part of a church that's soft on sin. And soft on sin was where they were playing guitars for the music. We believed in piano and organ. Wow. And so we had this distorted view of church. And I want to say up front, I'm so thankful for a number of things that were good about my background. Dad gave us kids a good work ethic. As soon as I could talk, he got me into scripture memory. We were always in church, like Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and even visitation. He had me practice the piano. I learned piano. He gave me a special future, a picture of a future that I knew where I was going to college at age 8. And I knew that actually at age 9, I knew I was going to be in full-time ministry. And I am thankful for how Dad set me up for a future like that. But there were some negatives. The negatives was these 6 rules, the culture of fear I had and was raised in. And it's almost like Dad was 2 people. He was one person at home and another person at church. At home, he was Mr. in charge, and at church, he was Mr. Servant, Mr. Helps. And the older that I got through my teen years, the more controlling the environment became, as well as the more detached Dad became from the family, spending most of his time in his wood shop. And I don't know if you've ever heard of dissociative identity disorder, DID. Dad was becoming DID, detaching. And eventually there was an affair in his journey, and that just scrambled our heads because one of the most important verses he taught us was avoiding the appearance of evil. And so that was really, really tough. And so, but I want to say, in these photos, the center photo is the dad and mom that I knew as a young boy. And then on the right side, in their final year or months of their lives. We can go to the next slide. In all of this, I'm sure we're familiar with the story of Joseph. He had a dream. There was a coat of many colors. He's hated by his brothers. But he understood relationships. And you can see that by the way he relates to Potiphar and the butler and the baker and Pharaoh. And if the story of Joseph says anything, it's the phrase "but God" appears 4 times in the story. But God intended everything for good to accomplish what is being done. And the thing is, Joseph lived his life in God's story, and the story that we live in will be the story we live out. And Joseph was totally convinced that God was orchestrating every step of this for good. And that's my story. I identify with that because God was setting me up for First Nations ministry, for working with people who are descendants of people who had no choice but had to go to residential school and live by these 6 rules. And so I think we have a lot in common. The abuse, the addiction thing. And so that's the basics of my story, the first part.
Wow, Dan, that's quite a story. And the fact that so many people are interested in your story tells me that this is not uncommon. And I just want to thank you for being open about your story so that others can realize their story is not unique in the sense that they're not alone. Many people are feeling what they're feeling, and then helpful for others who perhaps haven't been in that environment and yet need to have empathy and understanding for people who have. So, boy, it's a brave thing, Dan, for you to be open like this.
I think it's interesting, Dan, how Dan Woodard, when you talk about culture, when you were talking, and you and I have talked about this before, it almost seems a culture that affected a generation. And I think maybe that's why we all can resonate with it, because whether it was alcoholic parents or not, that seemed to be the way you raised people. And we can see the damages of that. Maybe our culture is changing, but there's still a lot of people, a lot of us who have to deal with those rules that people were raised with. And then you and I have talked about this before too. The other side of that is, it seems like we were either raised that way with these 6 rules and no movement, or we were raised with no rules. Is like just, and you can argue which is worse, but that seemed to be the generation. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of where you're going with this? You weren't a child of alcoholic parents, and yet you still had to deal with those same rules.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, John. I think that you're describing the difference between like hardcore control and neglect, just do whatever. And both of those are very dysfunctional and toxic, actually.
I'm just wanting to affirm you all for coming on and wanting to explore what would a healing path look like. And so here's where we're going to invite Dan to talk about what's the path out of this. What was the path out of this for you?
Well, I I treasure my healing journey. So I got married to Deanna when I was 29. She turned 25 the next day. And this PowerPoint is our engagement photo. And so we learned, or in the first few months of our marriage, we learned some things about ourselves. We sort of needed to, because we met, we were married 13 months later, but we'd only spent 10 weeks together in that 13 months. And so we had a lot to learn. Amazingly, I learned that I was raised with the rule: if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it. And Deanna was raised with the axiom, Christians never have to pretend. And so, there's going to be some slippage there, because obviously I am perceived as pretending, and I perceive her as she's not nice. So
Yeah.
And so we've been married for almost 38 years now. So we learned a couple of years ago that when King Lemuel wrote Proverbs 31, and he wrote, "Who can find a virtuous woman? Who can find a virtuous wife?" The word that King Lemuel used for virtuous means warrior. And so that's a polar opposite of a doormat, isn't it? And so what should Deanna be going to war with? And she has gone to war with foolishness and evil. Any day of the week, she'll take on foolishness and evil. She can smell it a mile away, either one. And so in our 6 months, at our 6 month of marriage point, I called a halt to our lives, and I said, we need to spend. I got some questions to ask you. I cannot figure out certain things, and surely you know the answer. Number one, where do you get all your opinions from? Like, she's asking for my opinion about everything, every meal. What would you like for supper? What would you like for lunch? Like, it makes no difference. And so, do you want me to make up an opinion on the spot? Like, how do you do that? And she gave me the most logical answer, which was, it helps if you know who you are. Well, I know who I was. I was Mr. Nice, and everybody knew that. and so the proof of that was I had lots of friends. I had lots of people who liked me, but Deanna was not impressed with the fact that I was Mr. Nice. She was not. And that was interesting to me. And so in our third year of marriage, someone offended me. Someone did something to take away my choice, I think, as I recall. And I just was very casual about it. She said, "What are you going to do when that person walks all over you and treats you like a doormat?" And I said, "Not a problem, because I know I can out nice them." And so you see, I had an issue with Mr. Nice that was not nice, but I didn't know that. That was my alcohol. I was drunk on Mr. Nice and didn't know it. And Deanna knew it, and she was trying to communicate it to me. This photo is at her 25th anniversary. I learned this long before this photo. You can go to the next slide. And there was an issue that happened a couple of years after we moved to Winnipeg in '89, and in '92, my parents separated, and this was their 38th year of marriage. I was 36 years old. This was huge. Mom and dad separated, and so I flew to where dad was and spent 25 hours of talking with him in 6 days. In the middle of that 6 days, he gave me permission for the first time in his life, in my life, to give him feedback, what it was like to grow up with him as my dad. I began that talk by saying, this is not a blame dad for everything. That is not in my heart. 2 hours later, he looked at me after I explained for 2 hours what it was like. He looked at me and said this phrase, "Dan, can you believe me when I say I am sorry?" And I said, "Dad, I certainly do believe you, because I see it written all over your face and especially your eyes." And right at that time, on this day at age 30, I was 36. I finally became free from my lifelong fear of all authority figures. And I tell you what, folks, I play piano, and I went to the piano and I played the Hallelujah chorus. How could I resist? And so I just want to show you, like, that was a phenomenal day. And I want to show you in my next slide what I had to, just briefly, what it took to renounce the Mr. Nice lies and vows. So there's a snapshot of the soul: emotions, choices, rational, and longings. First of all, in the emotions, I was timid and fearful of authority figures, emotionally flat. I was numb. I was never upset. I was very out of touch. And so I needed to deal with that. And I needed to start start identifying what emotions I'd stuffed in my pockets for a long time. The next thing is under choices. I had chosen to stuff my emotions, to shut down my volition, to let others choose for me, this having no opinions. I had chosen to trivialize choice, embracing a Christianity that emphasized externals. And then I needed to deal with that. And then under the rational, I believed that the ultimate of maturity was always being nice. That's fiction, but I didn't know it was fiction. I believed that I could and should always tolerate everybody and everything. I believed that if I would be nice to everybody, be nice to me. And that all needed to be faced and repented of and changed. And then finally, in the inner core of my heart, how can I make any difference if people don't like me? That's the wrong thing to ask. The right thing to ask is, what do I really want? I don't want just to be liked. I want to be loved. And nobody can love better than Jesus. And so we can go to the next slide. A few years after this, I was taking a course, and much of my growth has happened through taking counseling courses. And so I took this course. It was the most intensive counseling course that I'd ever taken. In the last class, the teacher gave a drawing of something to every student. And the point was, this drawing was what she thought of when she thought of me. She gave me a drawing of a tumbleweed. And so she was saying that I was a tumbleweed. And I thought, my goodness, I'm not a tumbleweed. She doesn't know who I am. And so we had the chance to push back or affirm it, or we didn't have to say anything. I decided I'm going to push back. And so I pushed back, and nobody said anything. I told her how I'm not a tumbleweed, but in my heart, I was thinking, oh my goodness, God, why am I still a tumbleweed? And I went 2 weeks later to a First Nations pastor friend down the street and shared with him the story, because I knew he'd taken the same course. And he looked at me after hearing my story, and he came over to me and said, Dan, you've been a tumbleweed all your life. but today God wants to replace that tumbleweed with a dandelion. And so from now on, your name shall be called Dandelion. and so for that reason, dandelions happen to be my favorite all-time flower, because God created dandelions to remind me that he created me to face risk and to do challenge and to risk trusting and talking and feeling and choosing and thinking and changing. All breaking the rules is huge risk. Growing, it's all about growing. And so all of that to say, but God, and caterpillars only become butterflies through inside out change. And the toughest growth we'll ever have is changing from the inside out, looking in the mirror, looking at our relationships, and taking an honest look at where we've been confined and a slave to these rules. And so God has been delivering me from being a dry drunk for years. And it is so wonderful to be free of these rules. And that's what we're trying to do, helping people to find freedom.
Wow, quite the journey, Dan. Describing where you were and how you came out. These people helped you. Your wife helped you. The classes helped, and then your good friend renaming you. It points to me that if we want to find freedom from these rules, we're going to need some help.
Yep.
John, as you listen, what did you think here about Dan's healing path?
Well, it has to do with identity, right?
Yeah.
We grow up having an identity forced on us, and then as we grow and mature, if we don't think we have a choice about our identity, then we just be who we were told we are. But if we can cross over that and say, no, I do have a choice on my identity, and then we meet Christ who recreates our identity, tells us who we really are. That's just an amazing healing. And I think that's part of the healing, Dan, you're talking about, but also that Jesus talked about. I can help you find who you really are, and who you really are is good.
That's right.
So true, John. Yep.
Yeah. So we went to this local church, or I should say, yes, Dan and I were part of a local church wanting to, first of all, identify these rules, and then to find a healing path out as a whole church. And we have on with us today, I believe, yes, there's Jim Stenstrom. So we're just inviting Jim to participate just for a bit here, because Jim was on the board of the church and invited Dan and I to do this path, this journey with them. So we really emphasized doing the small groups, Jim. So let me ask you, what did you find was the value of the weekly small groups discussing and practicing these things you're learning?
Well, just to let me get you or give you a little bit of the setting. I live in Three Hills, and very much life is dominated here by Prairie Bible College. And when I say that, it's a plus usually all the way down the line. But the church that I'm part of grew out of Prairie, and it's an independent church today, but it had its roots in Prairie. And so about 50% of the congregation are those 65 and older. And of those, many are missionaries, many are ex-Bible school profs, etc. So it's a very conservative kind of background. And so in terms of trying to change the culture of the church, what we found was that anybody who was under 50 felt like they had no voice. And so they were silent. And And, as long as things are going along well, that's usually not a problem. But when things did go wrong, and they did with us about 5 years ago, with, a pastoral team kind of breaking up, and all of a sudden there was this lack of trust. So how do we get that jump started? And that's where the two Dans came in. And it was just the most timely thing I could ever imagine for a church. And it really got things going. So the thing is, though, to have a one-day workshop or something like that, that's not going to change things, because these patterns are deep. And that's why these small groups became very essential. We tried to get most of our adults into small groups, and then they started talking. And of course, it wasn't just the older ones, it was the younger ones too. And so the small group thing started to shift people from just barely understanding what's being shared in the Let's Break the Rules series, but it moved it to where we started to own it and started to see it as a way forward. And it really did get the church talking, and then the trust started to be rebuilt again. And then, ultimately we were ready for change. And so we are a different church today than we were 5 years ago, for sure.
Wow.
Okay.
That's really, really good news. And your story there shows that groups can adopt this, as you said earlier, Dan. These rules can kind of permeate even into a whole church or to an organization. And we usually need a little bit of help to be able to break out of that. And that's what you've done, Dan. You've been willing to share your story and be open and transparent, and then talk about this path and how the healing comes. So I just want to be thankful for what you've done for others and for this church here with Jim.
Well, when we come to the end of our rope, God is trying to get our attention, and there's no amount of chaos but what we can't find him in that. And it was such a joy to see your church, Jim, to see them come alive and see them start talking, feeling, trusting, thinking, choosing, and changing. And God loves to bring freedom and life, the abundant life, to us, from wherever we are at now.
Yeah.
Well, John, yes, you probably have an insight on this one too.
Well, I was just going to say, we started off talking about the power of people doing this journey together. In Crest, we call it cohorts, but in churches and in this context, talking about small groups. And so I was just going to ask, to talk about the power of people doing this journey together and the healing together, and how that really is God's design for healing, isn't it? That there would be this experience and this learning, growing together with a small group of people. That's the way it's always been, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's, in fact, Jesus, when he came, he created a small group.
Yeah.
And he said it's going to be through you guys and through the transformation that happens in a small group that we can change the world.
Right.
That's stunning. And we really need to pay attention to what Jesus did, choosing 12. And the New Testament says he spent much of his time with them. Well, that should be pretty instructive to us. If we're going to see transformation, we're going to need a small group environment where we can do this.
Right. And that's even in this context, right? I mean, that we identify with everything Dan Woodard and Dan Reinhardt have written. We can see those rules in our culture, in our homes. And then we say, well, now what? Right. And so now we've seen some of the healing path. But part of the now what is, okay, we need to journey with some people through these things. Whether, as you said, Dan, that's counselors or a small group of people that love us and know us. Part of the healing path is really opening ourselves up to that idea and realizing that other people know or go through this as well, and we can actually walk to the other side together.
Yeah, and then to do that, Dan had this vision that he wanted to write a book. And actually, Jim, it came out of the experience of doing it with the church there. And so Dan and I together wrote this book where this is all connected to the scriptures. You can see on the left-hand side here, all the different examples in scripture that are part of the instruction that comes in the book here. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the things that the scripture helps us break free from. So it's packed with really good help and good information. So this is the first step in helping others. And Dan, you had a friend that had a comment here about this. Maybe talk about Pastor Ivan.
Well, Ivan is a First Nations brother of mine. We've been working together for over 20 years. And he himself was sexually abused in residential school. His story is very well known. I first met him when he was on his way to visit the perpetrator in jail. Wow. And he forgave him. And that was over 20 years ago. And he has had a ministry of doing many dozens of workshops on finding freedom from abuse. And so he heard the book, he heard the messages, read the book, and this was what he said, that this book states that he says, read it, devour, and live it. And I just am so blessed by, he has lived it himself, and he has blessed me so much.
Yeah. While it's good to read a book, I want to suggest to you that reading a book alone won't transform you.
True.
We have all read lots of books and often continue struggling with whatever we're in. The key, folks, is getting into a dynamic small group where you can actually be transparent safely, where you can engage these things and where you actually are accountable with each other. That's what Jesus did with the 12. We should do that when we're trying to do his work. And so to help that, Dan has created a small group curriculum series that can help you. Here's all the different things you can see. Here's the book right here. And then there is a leader's guide, which is packed with all kinds of good information for small group discussion and how to do it. And then there's a participant's guide as well to help them engage this and work it through. And then what really helps a lot of this happen is this set of videos here, where Dan and I took the initial work that we did with the church, and we re-recorded it into a DVD set. And this is really helpful stuff, because we start with training the small group leaders. And some of you on this call are small group leaders or pastors. And friends, it's the small group, and a healthy small group, where the transformation can happen. And so we've put together training sessions that will help you know how to do it. This is not your ordinary home Bible group. This requires a different kind of structure and different kind of way of leading. And then we also provide 9 teaching video sessions of the content of the book. Basically, it was the series we did at the church, but we've redone it into a small group format. And those 2 video sets together will be a real key to help you have conversations around all of this. And so we have the orientation here in the leader's guide and in the books that go with it. And in fact, there's 3 training levels. There's the leader's guide, the DVD videos, and then beyond that, Dan, amazingly, is making himself available with weekly online coaching. Now, friends, this is really an amazing offer that he's going to personally help you and your small groups work through this and help you with unexpected things that arise. So how do you handle this? What do you do with that? And it's very helpful that the small group leaders can actually have this happening. In fact, Jim, if you turn your mic on here and just briefly say a little bit about what it was like to have the weekly coaching from Dan for your small group leaders in the church there.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens in the small groups, and keep in mind we were trained as leaders, is we were able to ask questions that got the people talking. And in other words, the dialogue started to really come. And as a matter of fact, some of the training has to be the other end of it, and that is how to rein in running off on rabbit trails and all the rest of it that can happen. But the thing is that what we are battling is something that is a really deep-seated habit, just habitual behavior, etc. And how do you change that? And that's where the small groups helped you to move. In our case, we had 9 straight weeks of it. And it was interesting. We didn't have anybody drop out in all those 9 weeks, participants or even a group leader, in anything like that. It just seemed every week it was relevant, and it was really scratching the itch, as it were. And we just kept moving ahead, and we could just see the change in the church. The other thing is we had a good chunk of our church involved. So that was a good thing. And again, I don't think you're going to change the church if, say, you have 100 people and you only have 10 in a small group or something like that. It's got to be a wider scope than that. So, but it really does make the difference. And it does take time and effort and talking again, not just in 1 week when you're clear and then the next week you're fuzzy on things. You got to get that sharpened back up again. And so the small group method, I still think it's the best method. And by the way, like a good chunk of our church is still in the small groups that grew from that time. Wow. And this is like, 2 or 3 years later. So,
very good,
yes.
Very good. And Jim, you and others on the board modeled the behavior that you as board members stepped up and you led these groups and you yourself participated. And I think that was another key for your church, is that the leadership stepped up and said, we're going to do this, and we are going to be intentional to learn together and find another way of living. So I just want to honor you, Jim, and others who did that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just became a church-wide event because they saw that, like we as leaders were buying into it wholeheartedly. Yeah. And that sent that quite a message. So it was a church-wide thing. And even today, later on, because there's ups and downs and that sort of thing, even if you're into a situation today, you've got now a vocabulary. You've got people who have an intelligent way of truly understand what you're trying to say. And so even when I just walk up to somebody and say, let's talk, that totally means a different thing today than it used to. So it really does help. So yeah. Thanks.
Good. So friends, if you want to learn more, go to the website here, letsbreaktherules.ca. Everything's there. If you would like to maybe have this for your small group in the fall, here's where all the different materials are available. You're welcome to help your small group and maybe your whole church with this one. So it's a simple one to remember, letsbreaktherules.ca, and that stands for Canada.ca. So friends, it was good to be able to do this with you. And we are going to honor the time. It's 1 hour since we started. So we're going to say thank you for everybody who came. However, we also want to say, if any of you would like to stay on and just have an informal, ongoing conversation with Dan and myself, and you're welcome to stay on, but we want to just release all of you that do need to go. And thank you for coming today.